What ingenious meals kept families fed during the toughest of times in World War II? With extreme rationing and not a penny to their name, people came up with some creative ways to have dinner. So let's take a look at the budget meals they survived on. It was known as an economy loaf, and it was something to really stop and stare at. No, seriously. Even with how smart people were with their food and their recipes in the Depression, this was probably the most convenient trick of them all. I bet this is how the person who first founded trains felt like. Anyway, that's a lot of glazing. Let's show some value now. Economy loaves were something that were inexplicably tied to World War II. It was so hard to make do with the little amounts of meat and rations people had in their homes. Plus, a lot of typical staples of daily American eating were just gone. Bread, for one, was something that definitely became more of a luxury than a guarantee. The US government saw the sheer value in economy loaves and pushed the idea even further. Suddenly, every government pamphlet and community cookbook had a DIY, easy-to-follow recipe that you could use. Plus, the ingredients were readily available. Makes sense that they'd promote these since it means most of the fresher stuff and the meat goes to the soldiers and war efforts. It definitely died down after the Depression, but for what it was, the economy loaf was, well, economical. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. Beef barley soup is but a humble dish that comes right from tales of peasant wives making hearty breakfasts for their families. Sorry for sounding like a Lord of the Rings extra for a second. Really though, beef barley soup is as vintage as a recipe can get. Barley itself is one of the most ancient grains we have, not just in the States, but all across the world. Again, the idea of pairing it with beef is something we took from our European buddies that immigrated to Uncle Sam's greener pastures. When they weren't looking so green, and trust me, the 1930s and 40s were a long time, it was in everyone's mutual interest to play it smart. By that I mean there was a lot of inspiration to take from all the different communities around in the States. What is America if not a melting pot of different cultures? Beef barley soup used a lot less meat than the recipe typically calls for, but the substitute of roasted vegetables really brought it all together in a wonderful way. It was now not just a peasant dish for field workers, but something everyone had daily, because it was the best they could get. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put 2 and 2 together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasize the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? So you might be surprised to hear party franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? A pretty imaginative way of getting some familiar old flavors back into the weekly diet was mock food, specifically mock fish fillets. We're going to take a look this time at both this recipe and how exactly things like it became common. See, there's one thing about people from back then. While they definitely had it horrible, their circumstances really expanded their horizons in the kitchen. Mock culture was all about mimicking flavors of classic dishes with inexpensive ingredients. Stuff that was easy to get, wouldn't cut too deep into your pockets, and would also last you a good while. Mock fish fillets were actually made out of mashed potatoes. I really wasn't kidding when I said people really grew a newfound appreciation for potatoes. Recipes in cookbooks back then were using them in ways that the curly fries and hash brown-addled brains of you and I could only dream of. Still, there were times when even potatoes weren't available. In that case, they'd make use of bread. Now, you might naturally be wondering how bread even comes close to imitating the flavor of a fish fillet. Well, apparently, soaking it in some milk and mixing it with powdered eggs and flour actually forms a mixture that gets the texture down. Next, your spices: onion, parsley, pepper, and some pretty basic stuff, which was still easy enough to get. Though even those were stretched thin, spice cabinets would often run empty. Do you think this actually does the job? If you try it, share what you thought in the comments below. Fish souffle and baked potatoes were a wonderful combination, the kind of thing that just bounces off of the beach of its different parts and sides. The fish souffle, along with a generous serving of baked potato, wasn't just delicious, it was also extremely nutritious. This was probably one of the recipes that kept up health the most throughout the whole ordeal. You might be wondering how fish was common enough for the recipe to have this kind of weight behind it. It just so happens that if you lived near a coastal city back then, you were definitely in luck, at least compared to the rest of the population. Fishing skyrocketed, not as a hobby this time, but as a necessary skill. Fish were plentiful, and most of all, they were free. They were the main source of nutrition for a lot of places. When people had no use for fish as food, they'd sell it to make some quick money and get whatever necessities they needed. Besides, it was common enough to get things like crab in the waters back then too. Rolled flank steak was a much less expensive cut of beef. A lot of protein like fish and canned ham were used, but people couldn't really replace the need for beef. Of course, they had to make do, but that meant another thing. Less popular cuts of meat, ones that people normally wouldn't give a second glance to, became a lot more in demand. Naturally, you'd think that would mean they'd raise the prices, right? Not really, because then people would just buy the beef. Flank steak in particular was tougher and a lot more rubbery, but it was also really tender when you would slow cook it. It also helped matters that most home chefs knew their way pretty intimately around slow cooking. Next, you'd do whatever you could to make sure that the beef would last as long as possible. It was usually common to serve rolled flank steak with stuffing to make a pretty neat dish that required minimal beef. The stuffing itself was made from economy loaves, vegetables, and different kinds of herbs. An otherwise small and pretty hard-to-chew piece of meat would become a meal the whole family could look forward to, if you were willing to invest the hours it would take to make something of it. Most people were just happy to eat beef though, which made the prep work just a bit more bearable. Cherry tomato salads are pretty much just a really refreshing way to utilize your tomatoes. Thanks to Victory Gardens, which was a concept that spread like wildfire, all sorts of people were getting first-hand farming experience. When you get into that sort of thing, you soon realize the prestige of a tomato. It's one of the heaviest hitters when it comes to fruits. If you think I'm overrating it, well, I won't bore you with all the benefits of a tomato, but I will let you in on how easy they are to grow. These things can be grown from February to mid-March outdoors or indoors, in the ground or in a pot. This made them perfect for Victory Gardens. But tomatoes on their own aren't something you can do a lot with. That's where cherry tomato salads come in. This was a light-hearted, refreshing salad that really put some energy back into you, and it was pretty needed too. After a long day of working in subpar environments and just constantly being in bad living conditions, people's bodies really needed a good salad to jolt them awake. Plus, it always made for a wonderful breakfast. 3-bean baked beans were one of the best hits to come out of wartime cooking. They were a great source of protein, easy to grow, and readily available. Plus, a pot of these beans would set you and your entire family up for the rest of the day and probably the next one too. You really wanted recipes that didn't have a lot of specifics. You know those recipes on food blogs where if you substitute 1 or 2 ingredients, use what you have on hand, and call it a day, it falls apart? Yeah, that was not the vibe here at all. If we're talking about the themes of wartime cooking, 3-bean baked beans show us all of them. An adaptable recipe with ingredients you can find everywhere for cheap with a lot of crowd-pleasing ability. Basic beans like navy, kidney, and Lima beans were used. If you were in the South, you'd probably see a lot more of black beans, which were actually given a little more credit. Any gym rats watching should note that they're better for protein. Not only was it really easy to make and prepare, it was also really comforting to hit. That goes double if we're talking about winters. And man, those winters were really harsh. This next one is sauteed liver with tomato sauce. Okay, I get it. No one's that big of a fan of liver. I wouldn't blame you because, to be honest, I can't really get with it either. Actually, the government wouldn't blame you either, because they're the same. Not sure what I mean? Rationing efforts were actually decided by what seems to be a group of picky eaters. Remember how, when we were talking about rolled flank steak, we went over the fact that it was a less popular cut of meat? That was true for like a million other things. Rationing efforts focused most on premium cuts of meat, fresh produce, and popular vegetables. The stuff that wasn't so up to quality was left behind for the people. I guess it kind of makes sense, but also, wouldn't you be happy to get whatever meat you could during a war? That's definitely how the people back at home felt. Thanks to all of this, liver became insanely more popular. A lot of people realized the health benefits of it and how nutritious it was, and began using it in their daily diet. I guess you really can acquire any taste. Would you give liver a fair shot today? Or is that a little past our comfort zone? Lima bean soup is a little different. See, they wanted to scoop up all the grade A stuff, the easy sources of protein. I mean, you'd be pretty right in thinking that includes beans too, and yeah, lots of soldiers ate canned beans and soups made out of various beans. Luckily for everyone, there was, for once, just once during the war, enough to go around most of the country. Lima beans in particular were really popular throughout the Midwest and the South. Let me talk a little about what wartime cooking did for soups, though. While they were never really hurting for love or attention, you couldn't exactly call a bowl of soup the main attraction. Maybe today, in gourmet dining circles, that kind of thing could fly, but back then, there wasn't enough value for money. That quickly changed once people realized soups are actually a lot better all around when you make them at home. I'm not talking about taste, since that was still something people took time to get used to. I'm talking about utility. A soup can be readjusted so many times. It takes literally nothing but water as a base to make, and it can go around an entire large family. That's the kind of thing you hold on to tight during an economic breakdown, and nothing shows that better than Lima bean soup. Wartime living during World War II really shows you how much people worked with so little. During the war, butter and margarine were rationed pretty extensively too. That basically meant your local diet had a big void where fats should be, and that wasn't good for anyone. You'd need that stuff to cook or bake and just to get on with your week. Dripping was people's easy, one-stop solution to this crisis. When you'd roast meat, you'd get drippings from it. This wasn't just used once, but again and again as many times as possible. Pork or beef fat is another term for dripping, and it's still used in places today. But during the war, every home was working like this. There was such a strong mentality of not letting even a single part of an animal go to waste, and that didn't just include the meat and bones, but also the fat. I guess it's pretty admirable how much the brain can think of when you find yourself in situations like this. I really mean it when I say they didn't let anything go to waste. You might shiver at the thought of hot braised beef tongue, but back then, it was a proper delicacy. I'm serious. Forget tongue, they even ate cow brains. Beef tongue was pretty much a staple of homemade cooking during the wartime and the Depression. If you thought being resourceful meant eating one more fruit a day and mixing some veggies in, this is going to show you just how serious it actually was for people. Organ meats were really in high demand for a particular reason. They weren't rationed, and if they were, then the state's grip on it wasn't half as tight. Obviously, right? Tongues aren't notorious for their easy handling or how convenient they are to prepare. Instead, the government thought about killing two birds with one tongue and promoted the use of organ meats even further. This otherwise really tough slab of meat was made super soft, tender enough that it was familiar to the American palate via braising. Now, that had a trade-off. It meant that you had to slow cook this for a majority of the day. That's why braised beef tongues weren't a daily dish, but they were definitely regular enough. Luckily, not every community in America saw this as a shock. Latin American and Jewish communities were pretty used to eating beef tongue, and even Muslim ones pitched in with their best recipes and tricks. One thing about the 30s and 40s is that they had a communal spirit way above whatever we have today. Now let's take a little bit of a break from otherwise uncomfortable areas of a cow and go on over to Calico scrambled eggs. Not sure what I mean? Calico scrambled eggs were named that pretty much because they were really vibrant and colorful. It was tough to get fresh white or brown eggs because there was just too much of a need on the front lines for them. The war effort could still spare some powdered eggs, though even that had to be stretched. Adding some basic leftover scraps like herbs and vegetables really helped make it last long, but it was the victory gardens that helped the most. A lot of the stuff that you'd typically see in Calico scrambled eggs came right out of a victory garden. Bell peppers, onions, potatoes, tomatoes, and even spinach. People really discovered their green thumb during this time period. These weren't just filling, they were comforting and nutritious too. Most food during wartime just didn't consider presentability at all. I mean, no shade to them, it wouldn't even be appropriate to. Still, who can deny that your food tastes a little nicer when it looks pretty too? These scrambled eggs helped people remember the fun of eating a good-looking plate, but didn't really require any kind of time or work spent preparing it, which was really one of the best things about them. Vegetarian chopped liver was a pretty good alternative to the lack of meat overall. I know I also said that liver was a bit more popular thanks to the rationing and the tight supply of meat, but even that would run out at some point. Plus, these aren't concrete facts that apply to every area or neighborhood. Places in the South had a way different focus in regards to their diet than people in California or Washington. Rural neighborhoods definitely couldn't afford meat of any kind, premium cut or bottom-of-the-barrel stuff. Thanks to that, vegetarian food really took off. The scene was pretty much already set for it, with mock food culture constantly proving that you can at least get comfortably close to the flavors you couldn't have. Vegetables were just another way of imitating those same dishes, but this time in a way that doesn't put a hole in your finances. Chopped liver was pretty much a massive staple in Ashkenazi Jewish culture, but they started putting out vegetarian chopped liver recipes thanks to all the shortages, which were extremely regular. So what would you do when even most vegetables would run out? Well, people honestly just had their gardens and neighbors to fall back on. It was at the peak of the shortages where people would resort to pretty much onions stuffed with grape nuts, or potato soup, or just toast. Grape nuts were still just a little bit new since they were only properly introduced into the country by 1897. Of course, people warmed up to it pretty fast, given their current circumstances. It was such a good way of stuffing up onions, which were already pretty loaded with vitamins, that people just started doing it nationwide. Families really took to meatless meals because they kept them full more often and were cheaper too. The nuts were a way of adding some very direly needed sweetness to the onions. The real kicker is that you could actually just grow these right out of your victory garden. People were collecting crops like they were gold, and the ones that were super easy to grow were the most important. Still, even with the grape nuts, onions weren't exactly an inspiring lunch. No wonder you don't ever hear about this stuff, even if you look into the 50s and 60s. Pimento cheese spreads were creamy, tangy, and just about the savior that America needed. One thing that's consistent throughout American history is the country's extreme love of cheese. That just doesn't change. Pick any century, and you'll find cheese addicts across every state, which is why the shortages of dairy and cheese really hurt people a lot during the Depression and World War. It wasn't as if a source of fat just vanished. It was like a best friend went away to another country. Imagine if people took cheese out of your diet today. Not a fun scenario, right? Pimento cheese spreads were pretty much the holy grail of wartime cooking because of this. It started when mass-produced cream cheese really started to become a thing and began to use pimentos in it. This was somewhere around the early 1900s, but in the World War, the general recipe got revealed to the public. Now, obviously, people weren't in a position to get cream cheese, but sometimes, on a lucky break, they'd have some cheddar lying around. Pimento cheese spreads were made using that, and they became the lifeline of all kinds of people. Factory workers, students at school, families, rural class neighborhoods. Any sort of community or group you can imagine, I bet they had some fond memories with pimento cheese. Brace yourself for this dish as it gets a little crazy. Another wartime meal was crow pie, a dish born of necessity during World War II. Crow meat was widely considered a last resort, but desperate times called for creative solutions. The pie filling typically consisted of crow meat, stretched with whatever vegetables or scraps were available, like potatoes, carrots, or even turnips. The crust, often made from flour and water, was a rudimentary attempt to mimic traditional pie dough, as butter and lard were hard to come by. Herbs and seasonings masked the gamey flavor, making the meal more palatable. Crow pie wasn't a delicacy. It was a stark reflection of wartime struggles. It's said the name itself was a bit of a joke, highlighting the irony of turning scavenger birds into dinner. While it might not have resembled anything like the pies of pre-war days, it was filling, cost next to nothing, and made use of an overlooked food source. So the last stop on our list is probably as good as it got back then. There is nothing like taking advantage of nature's bounty with sweet dishes like apple brown betties, and if the subject is how a pie can put you in the right mood, then it is criminal not to talk about these. Usually made with apples or pears, berries, and other seasonal common fruit, the fruit would be baked, and layers of sweetened crumbs would hold it all together. The dish was the textbook definition of comfort food, and it screamed grandma's cooking in a time where many people did not know if they would see their family again. Lots of folks were suffering from malnutrition and hunger, but pies like this, which are easy to make with natural ingredients, were a blessing. Apple brown betties are not as widely consumed today as they were during the World War, but back in the day, people found solace in the dessert they could make with whatever little they had. The recipe is commendable and might taste weird to us today because of our modern tastes. And what they ended up doing was popularizing Dutch baby pancakes to the point where they became a staple of brunch culture in America. Just like you go to any roadside diner and the main attraction is their time-tested bacon and eggs breakfast, you went to Manca's, and the headliner was always a plate of these pancakes. Sure, now if you went and got them, they'd cost you $15 or more. These pancakes have been served in the United States since the early 1900s, and they are also known by the name of Bismarcks. But they really went mainstream as a result of cafes like Manca using them for their brunch menus. I gotta say, it was a pretty smart choice. People wanted more than just the typical IHOP pancakes they were used to, and the flavor and lemon syrup plus how many toppings just seemed to naturally gel with the dish made it a killer. You couldn't go by for long without a friend telling you to try it, and if they put you on it, then you could consider yourself lucky. You know, kids today will never know what a good Dutch baby pancake feels like. Modern travesty, I tell you. So pork chops and pierogi might seem like a bit of a mouthful, both to pronounce and to imagine, but this Polish dish brings America's favorite into one well-synced harmony of flavors. I'm talking meat, cheese, and potatoes, plus pork chops with pierogi, which are boiled and pan-fried to add that all-important crispiness you and I can't go without. The pierogi fillings can be dried mushrooms or sauerkraut. It doesn't have to be just potatoes and cheese. Meat prices were definitely more expensive in the 1970s, so you might be wondering how a dish like this lands on a budget-friendly list. That's because while pork, yes, was expensive, this dish didn't highlight the pork as a standalone selling point. It had the pierogi and vegetables going for it too, which meant that you didn't need a lot of pork, just enough for it to work as a combination. If you've ever spent time in Polish-American neighborhoods or restaurants, you've probably seen this dish around. And if you ever get the chance to, this mainstay of Eastern Europe's food is definitely worth trying. Tiki this, European that, Hawaiian hashes. Let's step away from all that for a bit. Let's delve into the Mediterranean and the Italian. Canned ham was like the instant ramen of foods back in the post-war days. In 1940, it started gaining traction as the miracle meat during World War II. It was also transported as an aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Canned ham was nothing fancy, which was the best thing about this meal. It was perfect for busy households or people on the run. Plus, its long shelf life was like the cherry on top. Back in the day, this was a convenience food dream come true. No fuss, no muss, just a whole lot of ham. But let's be real. Fresh ham is where it's at. Unless you're stranded on a desert island, I'd stick to the deli counter. We don't need to punish ourselves with canned meat anymore, which is why this dinner has become a part of ancient history. One of the easiest mixes available at the time was potatoes and sausages into what would be known today as potato piglets. Maybe the naming is pretty on the nose, but the taste was to die for. Sausages were still relatively cheaper than a lot of other options, so you would commonly see people replenish their stock at butcher's markets and meat stores. What was also equally as trendy was a good potato element in any dish, even in Woolton pies like we talked about earlier. So these piglets would incorporate potatoes into sausages to satisfy that void left in American hearts. And we have to say, they did a pretty fine job. Green Goddess dressing is exactly as fancy as it sounds, and it's definitely a step above your average French dressing or Caesar salad. I mean, come on, if we are supposed to eat salads every other day, you gotta keep some different ones in your rotation, right? We have a pretty exciting mix of sour cream, fresh parsley, tarragon, anchovies, and olives to make a rich green dressing that works amazingly as a dip or a salad. See, this dish got super trendy in the 70s because it was one of the first salads that people could eat and enjoy as a standalone meal. It was giving Americans options they didn't know they had, and it definitely boomed in places like California and San Francisco. Even today, it's a classic of the state's cuisine. It was first made by chef Philip Romer during his stay at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, so it's definitely got some backstory with the place. He wanted to make it in honor of the play with the same name. He was a big fan of the main actor in it, George Arliss. Philip thought European sauces were taking over the scene and were too heavy, too narrow. They offered one kind of flavor experience, and he wanted more, so he made something that was more than just that. Did I mislead you into thinking the 70s were all about getting fit and keeping your cholesterol in the ideal range? It was also a period of exploration of other cuisines, one of those being the tiki style of eating. Tiki cuisine had a lot to take inspiration from, don't get me wrong. Meatloaf. Who doesn't love this classic comfort food? But what happens when you get a sweet craving and add a little twist to it? Well, you get meatloaf with brown sugar glaze. Meatloaf is a traditional German, Scandinavian, and Belgian dish, and it is a cousin to the meatball in Dutch cuisine. But a brown sugar glaze? That's where things got exciting. This dish was a culinary experiment of the way days, and it's safe to say it was a huge success. Every continent came up with their own variations of this dinner, and it became a centerpiece at every dinner table. It was basically combining ground meat, breadcrumbs, and spices, topped with a caramelized brown sugar and ketchup glaze. What could go wrong with that? Meatloaf is still a staple for most people around the world, but you don't really see it get paired with a brown sugar glaze anymore. It was just a post-war craving, I guess. Think of a crispy and tender potato cake that has the perfect crunch to it too, and you have yourself a potato floddy. Potatoes were an ingredient that the horrendous war had not taken away from people, along with other basic necessities like wheat. So dishes involving potatoes saw a huge increase in popularity, and some rather forgotten ones like potato floddies got a whole new chance at life. Originally, it is popularly believed that canal workers came up with this oldie but goldie dish when they would cook grated potatoes over fires until they were golden brown. Whether they did invent the dish or not, it definitely was a comfort food for masses everywhere, and we can easily see why too. Considered classic 40s junk food, we would love to try a good authentic potato floddy today. It's said to have been inspired by angels on horseback. Yes, I know. The irony or the cheesiness is not lost on me, but that one used oysters in place of dried fruit. Still, it was all the rage in the 1970s. Especially at retro bars and cocktail parties, it was a perfect hors d'oeuvre, and it became a snack that you couldn't keep your hands off of at most parties. The most budget-friendly and common version of the dish is basic dry fruits and roasted bacon, but some also use blue cheese stuffings to amp up the comfort food factor. While it wouldn't win any awards in a naming contest, it has always been a staple of best-selling cookbooks and booked-to-the-brim parties. Now, despite what you may think, pasta dishes did not start trending in the 2010s like we know it. They've been something America has been deathly scared of for a year. Pasta primavera, on the other hand, was one of the few things that actually took off in the 1970s. It was one of the few dishes besides spaghetti and meatballs to get some kind of traction in the States. Pasta primavera itself is a dish that features vegetables in light sauces, and it was created by Sirio Macchioni. This guy went to Canada and had some Italian-American cuisine and immediately got the inspiration for this. One of the best things about this dish, besides it being immediately budget-friendly while having a sweet flavor, is that it was a sign of the times. The 1970s were kind of this weird self-reflection moment for America, where it was realizing that most people's diet is horrible and too fatty. People wanted to shift to something cleaner, greener, and healthier, and dishes like pasta primavera were paving the way for that. Sirio Macchioni knew exactly what he was doing when he made this, it seems, because this sautéed veggie dish is everything an American diet should include. Speaking of healthy, here's something else that followed the exact same tune. And onion sandwiches were once a lunchtime favorite. Liverwurst or liver sausage is a kind of sausage made from liver, so it was the perfect meal for when no part of the animal could go to waste. There were very limited meats available during the World Wars, and people had to use whatever they could find, including livers and hearts. Liverwurst was often spread thickly on rye bread and topped with thinly sliced onions. This sandwich was very popular in Europe and different parts of South America such as Argentina and Chile. I don't know about you, but the combination of iron-rich liver and pungent onion doesn't sit right with me. It was like a flavor explosion in your mouth, but not in a good way. I'm pretty sure this sandwich was invented as a punishment, but you know, people really had to make do with whatever they could find back in the day, and this dish was just a result of that experiment. Eggless sponge cakes might be a concept that you cannot imagine or wrap your head around today, but back then, a lot of people skipped the eggs entirely. What people used instead were margarine, sugar, and syrups to get the same vibe. What you got was a crowd entirely in favor of a sponge cake that was airy, fluffy, and made the best of your resources. Wartime brings out the frugality in everyone, but in this case, it brought out the inner baker with a quick fix or workaround for everything. If you did not have ingredients or could not spare them, then you did not have to worry. You could still enjoy a yummy dessert with your family, and this is a testament to human creativity and how even the bleakest of situations can never kill your sweet tooth. It's a Victorian-era appetizer, but hey, it sounds like it kept up with the trends of the time at least. The dish gets even sillier when you hear the ingredients. Before I start telling you, take a small guess. Maybe some seriously hot, throat-busting pepper? A rare, exotic cut of meat? Some kind of complex sandwich? The answer might be a bit of a letdown, but at least the taste isn't. Devils on horseback typically involve things like a prune or dried fruits in a tight and generous bacon wrapping that are then roasted. Creamed chipped beef on toast, often referred to as SOS, was a popular military meal that made its way into civilian kitchens. Now, this one was equal parts comforting and questionable. Think of it as dried beef, reconstituted into a creamy, salty sauce, and then plopped on top of toast. It's like someone tried to make a fancy grilled cheese, but accidentally ended up in the Weird Food Hall of Fame. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's definitely a unique flavor profile. It was also known as fizzled beef and was served as breakfast in many diners across the US during the post-war days. And it wasn't just limited to toast. Chipped beef was also often served on bagels, English muffins, biscuits, home fries, rice, mashed potato, and in casserole. Some people even tried flavoring it with Worcestershire sauce. Yeah, now we're talking. This one's faded from our dinner tables but hasn't been able to escape our memories just yet. If people can make an entire fake fish fillet and still be pretty satisfied with it, then other meaty wonders like liver definitely are not too far off the horizon, and chopped liver substitute would eventually prove that right. Something that became incredibly popular in the war-torn landscape of America because all it took was some onions, green lentils, walnuts, and salt and pepper. You had to make a paste out of it to get the texture of chopped liver down, and in terms of taste, this was a completely new experience, yet a significantly cheaper and easier one. It was much easier to get ingredients like these than good quality liver back then, and a lot of citizens stuck with this recipe even after the dust settled because they liked how healthy of an alternative it was. But one of the best parts of it was Polynesian chicken. Think of it like this sweet and tangy sauce or glaze that blessed the chicken with its thick, rich flavor. Now, the urge to take more steps towards tiki cuisine was something that was building up in the background since the 1930s, but it all really came to a head in the 1970s. In the 1930s, restaurants such as Don the Beachcomber or Trader Vic's would feature popular tiki dishes. This nationwide interest in other cuisines only really exploded as a movement in the 60s and 70s though, and Polynesian chicken was a big sign of that. It became something you couldn't separate from Mai Tai, like beer and dried fruit at a local pub. However, it wasn't exactly authentic. This American version has pineapple juice, garlic, ginger, soy sauce, and brown sugar-based sauce, and the chicken breast is marinated in that and served with stirred vegetables. The American take on it seems to up the sweetness a lot, but the original tiki variant plays up the tanginess a lot more. Retro tiki parties from the 70s would still have something that really reflected authentic Pacific Islander cuisine, but whichever version you got, you were in for a great meal. While we're on the topic of ham, this next dish added a fruity twist to it. Yep, we're talking about ham and banana hollandaise. Sweet banana, salty ham, and rich, creamy hollandaise sauce. Some might call it adventurous, others might call it a crime against food. This dish made a lot of buzz in the 1970s, and bananas have never appeared more out of their element ever since. It was featured in McCall's Great American Recipe Card collection in 1973 and took the world by storm due to its uniqueness. The hollandaise was a creamy sauce, first born in France and was originally known as sauce Isigny, named after a small town in Normandy famous for its butter and cream. This dish really proves that in a time of desperation, anyone will eat anything. But hey, at least it was memorable. Black pudding used to be one of the most precious desserts of America that people would chow down on every Sunday. And despite those simple joys being out of reach, people wanted to try their hand at recreating the taste and thrill of a black pudding with what was there on hand. Thus we had mock black pudding. This typically involved porridge oats or oatmeal, with thyme as the primary seasoning. If you had butter, then even better, but margarine worked just fine to give it thickness. What you had was something that did not truly capture the taste of a good black pudding pie, but was still awfully delightful to eat. It makes sense why people would go back to the original when it became a reasonable idea, though. 7-layer salad, on the other hand, goes back to the greener side of things, and you might get a little intimidated with a name like that. It's no 3-layer cake, As in, you will still be able to eat other things once you're done with this, so don't worry. It's actually this potluck dish that first popped up during the 1950s in the Midwest, and the reason it got that name is because of the way it's set up. Imagine, for just a second, lots of ingredients like iceberg lettuce, hard-boiled eggs, bacon, cheese, and mayo dressing, all layered up one by one in a clear dish. You can now see why the 7-layer aspect caught on. Plus, it wasn't just that this dish was really healthy and flavorful. It got popular for other reasons too. Most of the ingredients I just mentioned were things you could get under $5 total if you didn't already have them lying around. And in the 70s, especially during America's post-war period, people were tired. They were tired of the economy failing and rationing, all struggling to make ends meet. Long story short, they wanted food that was easy to make and prepare. Out with the 2-hour-long lasagnas and meatloaf and in with the salads and sandwiches, I suppose. So now you have a dish that looks good, works with a potluck, and tastes even better. Of course it was going to catch on. And even today, a lot of households that had family recipes passed down still fondly make the dish. Why don't you give it a try the next time you're looking for gut-healthy food? Since it is America we're talking about, it wasn't all ideal nutrition and calorically smart eating all the time. For every salad you hear about on this list, rest assured there were double the amounts of burgers and greasy fusion food coming out, or desserts that were sugar rushes incarnate. If you're a fan of pineapple on pizza, you would have loved this next one. Pineapple and cheese salad was a unique delight back in the day. This dish came into existence when someone decided to mix pineapple and cheese together in times of misery. Imagine cubes of pineapple in a creamy cheese mixture, terrifying or finger-licking delicious? There's no in-between. This was a variation of the infamous candle salad, which was a vintage fruit salad popular in America in the 1920s and was typically composed of lettuce, pineapple, banana, cherry, and either mayonnaise or cottage cheese. This was considered a luxurious delicacy during the tough times of the war, but just fails to meet the standards now. It's still a great way to use up leftover pineapple from your holiday punch if you're ever feeling adventurous. People that grew up during World War II will know that mixing sawdust with bread to fortify it so that your supply would last twice as long is not quite the urban myth it is made out to be today, but rather a sad fact of a dark time that people would prefer to leave in the past. This was something born purely out of necessity and a lack of basic necessities like flour. Since it was becoming so scarce across America, people's supplies of bread were running out fast and often. Bread was the only thing families had to eat too. With even that comfort gone, people took to mixing sawdust, which you could even taste in the bread. In some cases, it made the bread go bad faster, such as people when used too much of it. But in most other appliances of this technique, it worked as a filler when nothing else could be used as one. This would also set up a trend of consuming fiber in the 70s, even though most companies used cellulose fiber that was made from sawdust. So it actually does have quite a history in America. One of those, though not as sugary, was the apricot fluff. This first started getting a lot of movement in the 1960s because people suddenly got back into the alluring charm of whipped cream, and canned food culture had already sunk its teeth well into the populace, especially canned fruit. Now this dish involves whipped cream, canned apricots, and gelatin mixed together and chilled to make a nice and light dish that has the perfect fruity aftertaste to it, like apple pie. It started the culture of fluff food, which was always marked by its wallet-friendly nature and ease of preparation. Canned food was some of the cheapest stuff you could buy at a grocery mart, and making desserts out of that which the entire family could enjoy, down to the kids, was nothing short of some fine 10 out of 10 adulting. You can even put marshmallows in this too, by the way. A lot of people used to. I know I certainly would, and toast at that. You know, it's a little weird that German cuisine does not get more love in this country. Turkey tetrazzini was a mid-century Italian-American delicacy back in the day. In 1950s through the 1980s, upscale New York City restaurants, including Mama Leone's and Sardi's, featured tetrazzini on the menu. It was a creamy pasta bake made with turkey, mushrooms, and sometimes peas, all coated in a rich white sauce and baked until bubbly. This dish was named after Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini. In some variations, egg noodles were used instead. This dish was a popular way to use up leftover turkey, particularly after Thanksgiving, and it became a beloved comfort food in many American households. Today, it's less common to find it on dinner tables, but for those who remember it, turkey tetrazzini is a nostalgic reminder of family meals and holiday leftovers. Potatoes really are the gift that keeps on giving, and in this case, they could also be used to make cheese. Bacon does not have a monopoly on being the only versatile food it seems, as potato rarebits were a great display of how much you could really do with a potato. Grated cheese, toast, and mashed potato spreaded on hot toast was basically its own kind of sandwich that people could not get enough of. Something like this would pass even by today's standards, so we can only imagine how it drove the masses crazy back then. Luckily, we have dishes like Black Forest gâteau that challenge that stereotype in the most delicious ways possible. Whatever sparked that country's consuming passion for exploring foods of the wider world in the 70s, we desperately need that back today. The kids are growing up on peach raspberry vapes and Skittles. Anyway, this was one of those dishes with some presence. It became a symbol of sophisticated eating, and it was one of the finest multi-layered treats you could get your hands on. Americans absolutely loved having this in restaurants, and most French and European-themed joints did have their own version of a Black Forest gâteau. It uses Kirschwasser, which is otherwise known as cherry brandy, as well as maraschino cherries and chocolate shavings. Some 1970s adaptations of the dish, which make it a little easier on the finances, usually skip the brandy, and there were many home chef cookbooks that made versions of the dessert aimed straight at home cooks that wanted to get a little taste of European dining while not ever having to step foot outside of America. Fair play to them, but in my opinion, if you can spend a bit on this dish, you should, because it really is an experience. Hog's head cheese is one of the more bizarre meals on the list. Okay, before you jump to any conclusions judging from the name, this meaty meal doesn't contain any cheese or any dairy products at all. This unique delicacy originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. So, if not cheese, what was it actually made of? It was basically flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. This dish was popular in the post-war era as it made use of every part of the animal, reflecting a time when nothing went to waste. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It has disappeared from our dinner tables and menus, and I don't think this one calls for a comeback. There's no better way of repurposing leftover mashed potatoes than making potato cakes. It's a name given to various shaped potato dishes around the world, including a patty of hashed potatoes, a fried patty of mashed potato, a fried and battered slice of potato, or a flatbread made with mashed potato and flour. These fried patties were crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, often served as a side dish or breakfast item. In northern England and some states in Australia, a thin slice of potato that was battered and deep-fried was called a potato scallop. In Australia and New Zealand, the terms potato cake, potato flip, and potato fritter were used instead. They were often flavored with onions, herbs, or cheese and served with a dollop of sour cream, or alongside other breakfast items like eggs and bacon. With the rise of hash browns, potato cakes are barely missed today, but if you ever feel like cooking something comforting, I say give this one a try. Ever thought you would have a cassie with no meat in it? An economy loaf is just that, and we could not have named it better if you put a gun to our head. Using potatoes, peas, flour, eggs, and some basic seasoning, this was a loaf made entirely of alternatives to meat, so for vegans it is a recipe to keep in mind throughout the ages. But in the rationing-ridden times of World War II, it was a godsend to have this quick and easy loaf. It was even popular enough to be in cookbooks like The Modern Hostess, even its special patriotic edition. Roosevelt's presidency really saw some gems, right? Hawaiian hash was a cultural meeting point between Polynesian and American tastes, and it was one of the highlights of the tiki craving that everyone was having during the 1960s and 1970s. Those 2 decades were definitely about exploring all kinds of flavor combinations and new palates, but people took more to savory profiles than anything else, and this was proof. People were getting more and more fascinated with how Hawaiians ate, and I'm not just talking about a Spam and pineapple sandwich or drinking coconuts with straws. It was seen as exotic cooking, but it was really easy to make, which fit the preferences of the time. They wanted food that was easy on the effort and the wallet, and Hawaiian hash couldn't fit the bill any better. You got your diced ham here, some chinks of pineapple, bell peppers, potatoes, and onions, all sautéed in a sweet and savory sauce that usually gets served alongside rice. The pineapple was the show stealer here, and you could get the best ones canned and cheap, so it's no wonder that this became a healthy little meal people became fond of. There was overall a wave of pineapple-based dishes because people started seeing the fruit as some kind of element of exotic cooking. And dishes like that definitely show that opinion, even if it feels a little dated to hear now. Over the years, General Mills has always been the gift horse that keeps on giving. But canned luncheon meat was like Spam's less famous but more generic cousin during the post-war days. It was another affordable protein source that was readily available everywhere. It was used in sandwiches, salads, or simply eaten on its own when no other resource was around. It was also a good choice for big households when wallets were too tight back in the day. It was an instant hit in the States and made its way to other parts of the world before it became a pantry staple in Europe too. I mean, what's not to love about a cheap, easy-to-make meat option that's easy to store and prepare? But let's be honest, it's probably best left in the can. Unless you're a fan of processed meat flavor, I know I'm not. A more simple breakfast to get people's day started was creamed peas on toast. Look, lots of homes could only use so much butter and spices like cinnamon or other toppings very popular with toast nowadays were definitely out of the question. People still need a good kick to get their Monday in motion, and these peas were not only a wonderful source of protein, but the cream on the toast made for a filling breakfast too. There was a massive emphasis in World War II on dishes that prioritized nutrition while keeping you full or as full as you could get. In America, every household was more than willing to compromise a bit on flavor, elegance, or presentation in exchange for more practical food that still tasted all right. Creamed peas on toast understood the assignment perfectly and fit the bill. Herring, 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 where do we begin? It's one of the most beloved foods of the American nation, and one of those that becomes a shoulder to lean on in hard times. But that also means it's gotten way too much attention, and now the idea of herring is oversaturated. As in, everyone's had too much of it. That's why dishes like herring roe or fish eggs, as it's called in some places, help a lot. They breathe new life into these affordable classics that even our ancestors have been eating. Especially in the 1970s, where an interest in Scandinavian cuisine meant that people were exploring more seafood options for the first time and expanding their tastes beyond sardines, cod, and herring. However, lots of people decided to take what they experienced and apply it to what they love, and that's why we have dishes like herring roe today. Can you imagine that not only is this an affordable dish, it's also one that was served at cocktail parties and premium restaurants for a pretty penny? It definitely was one of the pricier starters you could get, and it got a knack for being cheaper than caviar while having more protein and being more compatible with the general tastes of the American public. You can feel wealthy eating caviar, but that doesn't mean you'll feel as happy as you would have if you ate some comforting herring. Corned beef hash was pretty much a mix of corned beef, potatoes, and onions. Corned beef, also known as salt beef, was popular in most Commonwealth countries during both the World Wars. Although the exact origin of corned beef is unknown, it most likely came about when people began preserving meat through salt curing. This dish was a practical way to use up leftovers and stretch food supplies, and was often served for breakfast or dinner. The best part? It was very filling at a very low cost. It is also the ultimate hangover cure before, or at least it was before people discovered avocado toast. But let's be real, nothing beats a good plate of hash when you're craving something satisfying. Wartime drippings were not the only instance of people using a strip of bacon to its last drop, literally. Bacon fat itself would have a lot of uses even outside of cooking, for example in arson and in making bombs. The U.S. Army would regularly request many neighborhoods and families to donate any extra bacon grease they could spare because it was key in making glycerin, which could be used to make gunpowder and bombs. The more you know about the world, the more it leaves you in awe how far human imagination can go. Bacon fat would be used again and again in different ways for cooking, but this is the first time we have heard of the kitchen coinciding with the battlefield. In 1971, it came out with the hamburger helper, and well, it definitely helped. This was a meal in a box with hamburger meat, and all you needed to prepare it was just water. General Mills understood that despite the current trends of the decade, there was still as much of a demand as ever for the typical, the classic, and the tried and tested. You could never separate Americans from their hamburgers, just like you couldn't take a fish out of water willingly. So it decided to target the biggest demand that was there in the decade, which was a way to have your favorite foods with half the effort. Work culture started booming. People didn't always have the time to go to a restaurant to pick out a burger, even if they were one of the families with a car then. So you had ground beef in a box that took nothing effort-wise to make and was affordable enough even in the face of rising meat prices from every retail seller and inflation. You could have dried pasta or rice along with it, which would come with the box, or you could just make an entire hamburger. The names are a little on the nose, but it really is your own personal hamburger helper. Ever tried hot Dr. Pepper? This warm beverage was made by heating Dr. Pepper and adding lemon slices. It was used in the war days to warm up your insides during the cold winter months. Say goodbye to hot cocoa, because hot Dr. Pepper was all the rage back in the day. It was pretty simple to make. All you had to do was heat the soda to 180 degrees in a stovetop saucepan, then pour it over a thin slice of lemon. It was introduced by the brand to increase sales during colder days when no one wanted a chilly soft drink. Smart marketing, don't you think? So, why did this drink disappear? Well, people just stick to the cold serving of Dr. Pepper now, and I'm not complaining. Lamb's fry was a dish that ain't for the faint of heart. Hear me out. Lamb's fry is lamb offal served as food, including the testicles, liver, sweetbreads, heart, kidneys, and sometimes the brain and abdominal fat. Yep, you heard that right. Walker's Hibernian magazine mentions breakfasts of nice stewed lamb's fry, eaten on the day of Swan Hop in 1786, so this one is pretty old and has run its course. The preparation involved slicing the liver and sweetbreads, then frying them with onions and sometimes bacon in a pan, and the dish was often served with gravy and mashed potatoes. The best part about it? Economical and nutrients, all in one. It's a classic dish that's fallen out of favor, but for some, it's a culinary treasure. It's rich, flavorful, and definitely an acquired taste. So, if you're feeling brave, give lamb's fry a try. Just be prepared for a strong opinion. Broiled lamb patties were a shoulder to lean on during the wartime. It was a lot more accessible than beef was, and there were still communities that were hunting lamb and other game available in the woods. It was common to make patties out of these because that was the most you'd get out of it. Plus, the patty format let people stuff it up with some vegetables and herbs on the side so that it would be a bit more filling while using a little less meat. Beef was always given high priority for soldiers, and it was really rare to see any of it being left for the people. That's why people flocked to lamb instead. Not only was it easier to get, but ground lamb was less expensive too. Broiling, on the other hand, wasn't as natural of a transition. A lot of people weren't familiar with how to properly broil beef. But thankfully, lots of community help made it an accessible recipe to try. Middle Eastern and Mediterranean communities in the States shared whatever knowledge they had on how to broil properly. As a result, these lamb patties were pretty much a mix of different cultures. Kind of poetic, given how the same applies to the country too. Ground lamb was also sometimes served with mashed potatoes, which on their own were like the silverest lining ever for people. It was made during holidays too, especially because of how warm it would keep you in the winters. The food stories of World War II are truly remarkable. Which cheap dinner did you like the most? Comment down below and don't forget to like and subscribe.